Notice that if we look at the dice bag runner from the previous day, in Eclipse I've highlighted all of the cases where we used polyhedral die as the type or as a constructor name in the program. We did this because all of our dice in the array are polyhedral die, and therefore we made an array of polyhedral die. But what would happen if we wanted to have a mixed bag of dice where we maybe had one die that was a d6, maybe even something that wasn't a die but was in fact a coin, and some polyhedral die as well? Is there a way that we can do that? And yes, in fact, there is, and it introduces the concept of polymorphism. Polymorphism, spelled as such, is the ability to have the correct method called for the correct class given a collection that contains multiple objects of different classes. So what polymorphism does for us, it allows us to have a coin that we randomize by flipping, to have a six-sided die that we randomize by rolling, a polyhedral die that we randomize in a totally different way, and any number of other objects that randomize themselves in ways that are appropriate for that specific object. So what does this look like? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we can't have an array of polyhedral die if we're going to attempt to put a coin, for example, into this array. But we also can't make it an array of coin. So what is the one type that coin and polyhedral have in common? And this is really where interfaces finally come back to give us another big bonus, because all of our randomizers are in fact randomizers because they implement the randomizer interface, and therefore we can declare the type as being randomizer. And here we can say we want a new array of 3 randomizers. Now remember that this creates an array, and what value is stored in each element of the array? It's an array with the value null in it. So we're no longer creating an array with dice in it. Now we're creating the dice array of randomizers filled with null values. So now it comes time for us to instantiate the first element of our array. And let's, instead of making dice 0 a polyhedral die, let's instead make it a coin. Is this allowable? Well, we can see right off the bat that so far Eclipse just fine with allowing us to do this. It hasn't detected any syntax errors, which should be your first clue that yes, in fact, this is allowed. You can store a coin object in an array of randomizers because a coin is a randomizer. Okay, then we're going to instantiate a new D6 in the dice array So here we're going to make this a D6. Now the D6 type doesn't, we have to use the default constructor, so we'll just leave the parameters as blank. And then finally, let's put a polyhedral die in as well. So now I've got a coin, a D6, and a polyhedral die all living happily within my dice array. Of course, this term dice no longer quite applies because one of my randomizers is a coin, but we can think of a coin as a two-sided die if we want. Okay, so now I'm going to roll the 10 dice. Now, what do I have to change in my code at the bottom here in order for my program to compile correctly? Well, you'll notice that there's one other place where I specified my type as polyhedral die. Now notice that what I'm doing is I'm assigning the value of dice at die index to this variable called die, and I'm making the type polyhedral die. Well, why is that an error? Are all of the things stored in this array a polyhedral die? And the answer is no, they're not. What they are is they are all randomizers. So if I make my type randomizer, now I'm allowed to do this. Now, notice that I have die.randomize, dice total equals dice total plus die.getCurrentValue, and what will happen is when it calls die.randomize, it will automatically know to call the randomize method for either the coin, the d6, or the polyhedral die, thanks to the power of polymorphism. And then I'll calculate my total, and my program should continue to run just as it always has. So let's restore the console. Let's restore the console, and let's run the program and see what we get. We got to increase the size of the console just a little bit. If it will let us grab that. Okay. Roll 1, the coin is showing heads, d6 equals 3, d20 equals 5, and total equals 9. Well, where did it come up with 9? If d6 is 3 and d20 is 5, and the answer, of course, is what did we say the value of a heads was when we created our coin class? We said coins with showing heads have a value of 1, and tails have a value of 0. So here when I calculate 1 plus 20 plus 0, I get a total of 21. Now if we want to see this in action, we should be able to watch this much more effectively by putting a breakpoint right here in our code and another breakpoint right here. And let's see if we can catch die.randomize doing the correct randomize method for each of our types. So now I put my breakpoints in. Now I'm going to run my code in debug mode. I always want to remember my decision and let Eclipse switch its viewing context to debug mode. Okay, so now notice that if I hover over die here, or actually if I go to die right here, notice that I get the coin is showing heads when I click on it in the debugger. I realize that text is very small. I apologize for that. Haven't quite figured out how to increase that size just yet. So now let's look at what happens if we step into. Now the only thing to be aware of is sometimes you're going to go through some layers of code here, so we may see some gobbledygook. But let's try it. We're going to step into, and look at that. We're in the randomized method, and if I scroll up here, look where I am. I'm in the coin class. Why? Because my current, I'm going to hit resume here to jump back out, because my die index is 0, and what did we put in dice 0? A coin. So now when I go to calculate the die total, again, if I click on die, it's heads, and what do we know the value of a heads is? Well, of course, it's 1, so we step in. So what should happen here? If it's is heads, should be true, so I should get 1 as my return value. So what is dice total? It's 1, just as we expected. Again, notice it's calling the get current value and randomize for a die. But what's going to happen when I go to dice index 1? So die index is now 1, and if we look up here at the code, dice that what's stored at object at index 1 is a 6-sided die, a d6. So when I do randomize now, look where I ended up. I ended up inside of my D6 through the magic of polymorphism. And if I do the same thing here for my get current value, boom, I'm at my get current value for my D6. Okay, we're almost done. Let's repeat the process. So now I'm going to run it again. My die index is now 2, and if I click on my die here, notice it already tells me it's a D20, which has the current value of 3. But let's actually see the code I'm going to step into. And where am I here? It looks like the same code as the D6, which it should because we wrote the code. It's almost exactly the same. But if I scroll up here, I'm actually in polyhedral die, not D6. And again, the same thing can be seen when I go into get current value and scroll up to see where I am. I'm in polyhedral die. Okay, resume, and I'm back. And notice I got roll number 1. The coin is showing heads. D6 equals 6, D20 equals 15, and the total is 22. That is all done through the magic of polymorphism. I'm going to switch back to the Java view here. Eliminate the console so you can see the code here at the end of the lesson. And let's just run it one more. Actually, no, we're good. Okay. Well, that is our introduction to polymorphism.